I want to thank you once again for pulling this publication together and for really just and bringing together a very, very important and topical issue that we are confronting, not only here in South Africa and the rest of the continent as well. The first point around the Africa Rising narrative, it's something that I suppose if we were having this conversation just 5 years ago, we would be just talking about the Africa Rising, this notion of linear economics, we either rising and falling. And Iraj and I we've debated some of these things over the years, and it's very, very interesting that we were all captured by a very similar story, a story that didn't really have a lot of substance and background and meaning, and one that we were misled by a range of consulting firms and transaction advisory firms. I'm not going to mention any of those just yet, but lines running through the continent just bring to mind some of these misaligned and misconstrued reports that led us down this path that was not really well informed by data and information, and very importantly by history. And because very few regions around the world, including our very own region of Africa, if we look at it, had a linear rise and basically another plummeting fall. So we were always obsessed with this rising and falling notion around Africa, whereas if you look at the record of African growth and development, it's a story of mixed performances. We've got large economies, small economies, and to this day, right now, we are experiencing some of the fastest, or we are seeing some of the fastest growing economies on the planet in Africa, albeit they very, very small economies. And it's much more of a mixed bag of high performers, low performers, and obviously very big disappointments. Right now, the Africa Rising narrative in 2016, 2017 is enjoying a growth rate of around 1.5%. But that's mostly on the back of a growth rate in South Africa, or let's call it an economic recession in South Africa, and mixed or coupled with an economic recession in Nigeria, the two economies that make up nearly 60% of the GDP of Africa. So I think we have to contextualize these narratives. We have to understand them a little bit more in a much more granular fashion to understand what is the real narrative behind Africa, and it's not one of just simply rising or falling. Just to add one little point and one little piece of data that you can share with your families when you get home later this evening. 10 years ago, in 2007, there were roughly, I think there were about 70 economies around the world that were growing in excess of 7%. That's a huge number of economies. Today, there are just 7. We are now, 10 years later, firmly entrenched in a very, very low growth paradigm. And that, if you look at world history, if you look at global history, is the norm. So this previous period of high growth, where we saw double-digit growth figures, mostly led by China and the commodity booms, is over. And we're going to need to look at very, very creative ways of how to squeeze out growth, not only for countries, but for companies as well. Now, extending this to the idea of the rainbow nation, I presume you're asking me to comment on inclusive growth and whether we have actually experienced healthy growth. And when I think about healthy growth in the South African context, it's a growth that will be inclusive for all parts of society and very, very importantly, allow the majority to catch up with the minority. And we have not seen that. And unfortunately, and maybe Raj can comment on this in his interjection, is we did not really have the right economic policies in place. But perhaps, I don't think it's really about the plans. I think it's more about the implementation. But one other very, very interesting point, which I always share with my students when we talk about economic growth in South Africa, I refer back to professional sportsmen. And I think about how sportsmen have what they call muscle memory. And what we see in South Africa, in the South African context, and I always ask them this question, and I won't ask you this, but you'll know off the back of your head, or in the back of your mind. When was the last time that we achieved 6 or 7% growth rates in South Africa? 7% growth rates, which back in 2009, 2010, were the growth rates that the Zuma administration was suggesting was needed to really, really make a dent in the unemployment and social deficits in this country. 7% growth rates. Can anybody answer that question? Not you. Anybody else? 1967 was the last time we achieved growth rates that would really make a real impact on unemployment in this country. If we were professional sportsmen, we would not have the muscle memory in this generation to remember how to grow. And I think that is a very, very important thing. We need to learn how to grow once again. The role of the private sector in Africa's development. This is the chapter that I cover with my co-author Adrian Katemba, who's sadly not here. He's a Ugandan, so it added a very, very interesting dimension from the East African perspective, and that's why we used a number of East African examples in that. I'm not going to go into a long explanation of that because I think we can go into that in more of the Q&A. But the role of the private sector in development has become paramount, and it's not only in these concepts or these notions of shared value and impact investing, which many of us actually study at length here, especially at a business school like this one. It's around creating productivity. It's around using firms to build productivity. And your question to me, Umzu, was mostly around what can be done to help the private sector deliver on this role of in development in the African context. And it's simply creating the environment that is conducive to business, creating a competitive environment. And we're just doing, strangely enough, we're involved in another research project at the moment with my co-author at the back, Liesl Rees, where we are evaluating the business environment across the continent according to the metrics of the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business reports, and comparing that business environment with the other environments among BRIC plus Mexico, the BRICS plus Mexico. So it's the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and Mexico. Not the most competitive emerging markets on the planet, I might add. But when we look at those, with the idea of trying to develop a story around the environment that will nurture competitive multinational corporations, we see that multinational corporations that are based in Africa have got a huge uphill battle to fight when it comes to things like red tape, when it comes to things like infrastructure, energy, all these other things. And what it basically tells us is that the multinationals in Africa will not achieve the scale and levels of competitiveness of their counterparts in other emerging markets if these enabling features of the business environment are not addressed with urgency in Africa. And if they can't become profitable and active, and I mean really, really active in and among societies across the continent, then we will not see them developing their key role in the development of the continent.
What went wrong? I think the 3 or 4 protagonists of social development, the state, business, labor, and civil society. Soon after 1996, towards 1999-2000, all 4 of them faltered. The state went into a transformation not to enable itself or set itself as a machinery of transformation to redress the legacy of the past. Instead, it occupied itself with who should be doing what, how quickly we should racially and optically transform the organization, not from a capability point of view. And for a moment, one cannot just deny the fact that it was an imperative. It had to happen. Business was 3 years between 1994 and 1997-98, very, very agnostic and non-committal. But then when they realized that a new policy is going to stabilize and improve, and the rating of the country started improving, they got to making money. They forgot about the legacy of the past. They forgot about doing their part in a multi-generational redress of the past. They thought that if they can just tick the boxes, you want me to have a BE partner, I'll bring one of the big 5s, and big 5s will make the right phone calls and things will happen. The big 5 became big 6, big 10, but that's about a double-digit number of empowerment. They forgot about the history and the magnitude of redress that had to happen, and the critical role that business had and still has, in my view, in that process. So labor went into a different zone altogether. They went off the mark completely, as much as business went off the mark, except that business went in making money, labor went to become a power broker, not taking care of the interest of the labor and the working age in the age of technological revolution. At the time that technological revolution was going at a rate like never before, instead of unions focusing on retraining and keeping the companies focused on job security and employability in the age of technological transformation, they decided to take a slate in the ANC and become the power breakers. Some of them became sort of champions of change. They didn't like the new liberal thing. They concocted these terminologies to change the political narrative. Vavi, who's not here, unfortunately, he should be sitting instead of Becky. So we can look into his eyes. Despite his confessions, they became the opposite of what unions are supposed to be. So the unions faltered. And the civil society thought, well, we become a rainbow nation. The bad dream is behind us. Let's go back to having some peace and comfort. Now, these are the four protagonists of any social development. In good societies, in normal societies, never mind in the abnormal society that we had inherited in the second half of the 1990s. So the result is what we see now. We've all now, unions are confessing to their mistakes. Government, political parties from the political office, they say, yeah, we have problems, we have mistakes, but forgive us and we'll correct ourselves. They're begging for forgiveness on the pretense and on the altar of undeniable abuse and corruption. What then happened in the process, we corrupted the very machinery, the infrastructure of the state, which is the only means in the modern societies of systemically dealing with inequalities in the society. Instead of worrying about the quality of education, we've destroyed the very system that is meant to worry about it. Instead of worrying about public health, we have destroyed the institutions, and so it goes. I hope you get the drift of my point. So we have basically hollowed out the very instruments of developmental state, sadly and tragically on the very altar of developmental state. Remember in 2009, we wanted to do with neoliberal things because we want to have developmental state. Developmental state was an excuse and a political ploy for destroying the machinery of the state. No society that we know of. As a student of social science, I challenge you and anybody to show us otherwise. There is no society in history that can sustain its developmental momentum without a capable and committed state. So a state is pivotal. But we have destroyed the state and we have to rebuild it. I'm going to the solution of what should be done. Is it all doom and gloom? No. I do not believe that we should buy to that narrative. The fact is that the South African economy, even as we speak, has got huge potential and actual capabilities that we need to rebuild, armed with the bitter lessons that we have learned over the past 20 years. And that is, the minute that we allow social cohesion to be fragmented, under whatever the excuse and pretext, we are digging our own grave collectively. Proverbially, we are on the same boat. We can't afford to pick holes in it for the right or for the wrong reason. So that's one. The second one, we do have a very diversified economy. Not many societies have that. And that's a fact. We need to build that. That's an enormous amount of, an enormous and powerful anchor of stability and stabilization. The third, within the South African Inc., despite all the things that have gone wrong, there are still a lot of pockets of excellence in the state. There are pockets of excellence in academia, in civil society, in our court system, in our constitution, and these capabilities are not aligned, but they exist. So they need alignment. And finally, what we do have that many societies don't have, societies in the same position that we are. We see countries like Turkey finding themselves in trouble. We see countries like Brazil finding themselves. We see countries like the United States finding themselves into trouble. We don't have time to go there, but UK has got its own problems. So there is a global problem also, and that has to do with the fact that it is, whether we want or not, it's a new dispensation globally. The notion of power, as we know it historically, has shifted. And globalization, technology, connectivity, and all of that is in that mix. But we need to understand that power for development, power for rectification of historic or contemporary maldistribution of income, youth unemployment, abuse of women and women's rights, all of these are issues that are new in the level of consciousness. They've always existed, but never ever have we had it at the level that we see it now, and we see it globally. So we need to then bring capabilities of our nation together and rebuild, having learned from our 20 years of experience. Unfortunately, poor experience, bitter experience. And to just finish it off, I think we need to be extremely serious about the level of human suffering that happens in the land of plenty as we speak. That human suffering, we all have to take responsibility for. And we need to do something about it. It is not an academic exercise. What we discuss in this forum and similar fora is not a theoretical situation. It's a very, very real situation. And let me give you two statistics. And this is fresh on my mind because I was writing something last night, and I was shocked. We have, we know, 16, possibly 17 million welfare recipients every month. If they don't get their money at the end of the month, they cannot survive. And then here comes the shocking complementary number. 54% of our employed South Africans, some of them members of COSATU and not many are not. 54% of South Africa's national employed people are poor. They are working poor. In agriculture sector, the figure is almost 90%. In the domestic sector, which is a major employer, it's above 90%. In the mining sector, it's 23%. You'll find this in this report too. So that roughly, so we have 17 million who are recipients, officially poor. We then have another 6 to 7, pick a number. That it makes it, what, 23 million of a 54 million population are poor. And this is real.
Sure.
We need to do something about it.
Look, the starting point for me is that we have social